Hey guys, this video is going to get into variables and equations. As we go through it, you'll learn what a variable is. You also learn about rearranging equations. That's a really important part of this video. We're going to have an ESQ on it later, so it's really important that you take good notes and come to class with any questions, things that you don't understand. As we go through, we'll talk about the purpose of rearranging equations and also how to rearrange equations. So let's talk about variables. When we talk about variables, let's consider a hockey game. We have 3 periods in a hockey game, and each period is 20 minutes long, so that gives us a total play time there of 60 minutes. And there's a couple of intermissions, and each one of those intermissions is 15 minutes, and that gives about another 30 minutes right there. Total play time for a game is 90 minutes, or an hour and a half. So the question is, when you go to a game, how come it can often take way longer than an hour and a half? Usually about 2 to 3 hours. How come a game is 2 to 3 hours if the total play time is only 60 minutes and there's a couple of intermissions that go for 30? The time of each game, from the time that you get there to the time you leave, will vary depending on the things that are happening on the ice. Maybe there's an overtime. Maybe there's a lot of commercial timeouts. Maybe there's a lot of stoppages of play on the ice because of penalties or for other reasons. Maybe there's a delay of game. Maybe there's an injury. All of these things can add to the total time that the game will go. So a variable simply is anything that can change. Even though a hockey game is supposed to be about 90 minutes, including your intermissions, and even the intermissions can change. They're supposed to be about 15 and a half minutes, but they can go longer if it's a nationally televised game. So just like a hockey game, variables are anything that can change, just like the time in a hockey game. So let's talk about why we're going to rearrange equations. Here's an equation for velocity. It's got a few variables here. We have velocity, which is how fast you're going, distance, which is how far you go, and time, which is how long you drive for. We'll get into the specifics of that a little bit later. So for right now, let's just consider this. We can rearrange this equation any one of 3 different ways. We can rearrange it so we solve for velocity. We can rearrange it so we solve for distance. We can rearrange it so we solve for time. All equations, these three equations use the same variables. It just depends on what you're looking for. Let's take a look at this density equation here. Again, here's another equation we're going to be using later on this year. Density equals mass over volume, 3 different variables, and we can rearrange that to either solve for mass or volume. Here's the point. We started out with 2 equations, the one for velocity and the one for density, and then we rearranged each one a couple of different ways, so we wound up with 3 equations for each one. It's a lot of work to memorize these 6 equations. And things can get pretty darn confusing once you start pulling in a whole bunch of other different equations. You got to be a rocket scientist to really remember everything and figure out what's going on. Instead of remembering all this jargon, what we want to do is have one process to rule them all. And what I mean by that is, instead of memorizing all the equations, we want to figure out how to rearrange them through one simple process using multiplication and division. Okay, so before we get to how to rearrange equations, let's take a look at this simple example here. We have 3 variables, a, b, and c, and we have a value for b and we have a value for c. So solving this problem is really easy. We just have to plug in the numbers. A equals b over c, and a equals 100 divided by 2, a equals 50. The reason why I threw this one in here is because I wanted to show you that what I'd like you to do is make sure that you always circle your answer, always make sure you sub in numbers and units. We didn't put any units in here yet, that'll come later, and then solve. Also, notice that I have our variables written down the side here. I have what's given to me down the side, and I have what I'm looking for over here with the equation up on top of it all. It's a good habit to get into this. It'll help you stay organized, and you'll have fewer problems on down the line once we start getting into word problems. Let's go ahead and talk about now how to rearrange an equation. Here we have that same equation, a equals b over c, and this time I gave you a and I gave you c, but what we don't have is we don't have b. That's what we're looking for. That's what we want to solve for. Now, a lot of people may want to go ahead and throw in the value for A is 50 and throw in the 2 here and then leave the B alone. We're going to kind of get out of that habit. What I'm looking for you guys to do is to always begin with the equation. Start with the variables. It works out much easier rather than just putting the numbers in and then moving all those numbers around while we rearrange the equations. In addition, once we start to throw units in here, to move the numbers and the units around before you move the equation can be really annoying, and a lot of mistakes can happen there. We're always going to begin by multiplying by the denominator. In case you don't remember, the denominator is the underside of a fraction. And then if we need to, we're going to divide. I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. So let's go ahead and begin with our equation. A equals B over C. Done. And let's go ahead and start and multiply by the denominator. What's on the denominator here? The C is on the denominator. There's also a 1 underneath the A, but we don't write it because we don't need to. But I am going to throw a 1 over here, and here's why. It's a placeholder. What we do to one side, we do to the other. And let me go back to that placeholder thing real quick. Here's a mistake that some people make. They go A equals B over C times C, because what you do to one side you do to the other, and they went up with C times A equals B over C squared. Because instead of canceling out the C's, they had C times C, and this is a big mistake right here. We don't want to wind up with this. Now we have a more complicated equation. Let's stay away from this. The easiest way to do that, throw the C over 1. It's a nice little placeholder. It doesn't take much time, and you'll avoid mistakes later. What happens here? The C's cancel out. And now we wind up with an equation. C times A equals B. Or we can write it another way. B equals A times C. B equals C times A. No matter how you write it, all three of these things are the same. And what's nice about it is we had the value for A and we had the value for C, and we can sub in and things become pretty easy. B equals 50 times 2, and B equals 100. Now when you go through with me, it's not necessary to write all the different ways that you can write this equation. I was just showing you, for example, that all these guys here are the same. Let's consider now what happens if I give you A and I give you B, but now we're looking for C. And again, that's represented down here. A is 100, B is 100, A is 50, and C is what we're looking for. Those same rules apply. We're going to begin with the equation, and we're also going to multiply by the denominator, so it's going to look like the last one. But then we're going to add that second step, or that third step, which is divide if necessary. And here's what it looks like. A equals B over C. Our denominator is C, and what I do to one side, I do to the other, times C. The C's will cancel out. If you're not sure about this canceling out thing, ask me about it in class tomorrow. I'll explain it to you. And then we wind up with our familiar C times A equals B. And now our goal was to get C by itself. How do we get C by itself? We got to get rid of A. We can't subtract it because this is a multiplication problem. So we're going to go to our third guy right here. We're going to divide, and that's that divide if needed thing. If we divide by A, we're going to wind up in that canceling out situation again. And what you do to one side, you always do to the other. So the A's will cancel out. And here's what we're going to wind up with. C equals B over A. And now check it out. This is the only way to write this equation. I guess I could split it up if I wanted to and make more work for myself. I can go this over 1 times 1 over A. They are the same thing, but this is a heck of a lot of work, and we don't want to deal with that. This is a nice simple equation where I can now plug and chug. And let's see here. We got our C equals 100 over A, which is 50, and C equals 2. Real simple. Represent the answer by boxing it off or circling it there. Always use a pencil when doing your math work. It's the last little bit of advice I have to give you on here. So let's take a look here at what we've covered. We know what a variable is. We know how to rearrange equations, and we know why we're going to rearrange equations. It's going to be a time saver later on. Instead of memorizing all those different equations we're going to go through. We also know how to rearrange equations. 3 simple steps. Begin with the equation, multiply by the denominator, and then divide if needed. Again, we're going to have an ESQ on this stuff. We're going to get some practice in class tomorrow. If you have any questions, please bring them in tomorrow. Also come to class with a pencil.